What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the combat basics for Baldur's Gate 3 just ahead of its launch. And with a lot of people looking to dive into this game for the first time, or potentially even playing D&D 5e for the first time, it seems like a pretty good time to go over it. That said, I wasn't really planning on making a video like this, as 5th edition is a very popular rule set, but enough people asked me this question that I figured it was worth its own video, if only to ease people's introduction to this game, as making CRPGs accessible is a big deal for me. But to kick this video off, a few things of general note right here at the beginning. As I mentioned, Baldur's Gate 3 uses the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition rule set. That's very important because 5th edition D&D is by far the most popular of tabletop rule sets, for a variety of factors to be sure, but a big part of that is that it's a very approachable rule set. It's relatively simple, it doesn't lean in on the math very much, and compared to something like Pathfinder 1e, which I play a ton of, and have made many videos on its relevant video games for, this is a simple system by comparison. So while it can still seem a little overwhelming at first, once you get used to it and kind of see how the pieces fit together, it's very simple, especially in a video game. Which brings me to my second point, which is simply that the game is going to do the math for you. It can be helpful to know how that math is added up and how individual mechanics work so you can understand what you are doing and why you might make a decision versus another decision. But ultimately, we have a relatively simple rule set being translated into a video game, which is going to do most of the work for you on top of that. So with those two things combined, it's a very approachable system. And if it feels like you're getting caught up in the math of the things I'm explaining, just keep in mind you're not going to have to do any of that, the game will. Another thing about 5th edition, though, is that the reason it is so simple in terms of its mechanics is that it is very heavy on the roleplay side of things. A lot of things are intentionally left vague so that you, the player, or in this case the video game, leaves room for you to roleplay whatever it is you want on top of that. And Baldur's Gate 3 is leaning into that very heavily, so if you're not deliberately playing on the highest difficulty, don't worry so much about getting the absolute best build possible. Go with what feels fun to play, as that's what's going to keep you playing. Though on the topic of difficulties, this game will be launching with a few different ones, at the very least a version of easy, normal, hard. So if you are brand new to the game, or the system, and chances are if you're watching this, that might very well be the case, do remember you can just turn that difficulty down until you get to grips with everything. Ultimately, it's a video game with a very heavy focus on role-playing, and you deserve to enjoy the thing you paid for. It's not that big a deal. From there, let's actually start diving into these systems, though. The first major system of note is your ability scores. This is really the last part of character creation, but once you've decided what class you want to play, what race you want, all that stuff, when you get to ability scores is where things start getting important in terms of combat especially, because each of these scores is going to do different things for you and are either more or less important based on the class you chose. I've already covered most of the classes besides Monk, so I'm not going to go over that in painful detail here, but it's still important to have a basic understanding of what these do. Now, before we talk about each one individually, ability scores can pretty much be from 1 to 20. 10 or 11 is considered an average human being in terms of representation of what that stat actually means. For every 2 points above 10, so 12, 14, 16, etc., we get +1 to the modifier for that ability score. And then as we start to move below 10, we start to take penalties to that modifier. Modifiers are used for a variety of things in terms of the relevant skills, saving throws, etc. You don't need to memorize what each one is, but you do need to understand the modifiers you have for each ability score. Naturally, the things we want to be good at need to be as high as possible. This is again going to vary by class. The modifiers themselves are used to modify various rolls that are based off of that particular ability score. So if I want to make a strength-based attack, that uses my strength modifier in the appropriate places. Now let's start going over these ability scores individually. Strength and dexterity are generally used for attacks and a couple of other things, but generally speaking, speaking, if you're playing a character that is going to be swinging a weapon, they will either have a high strength or dexterity score to reflect that. Strength is most of your melee weapons. It also determines how much your character can carry on top of your general athleticism. So it is very important for our frontline characters that are swinging weapons around. Then we have dexterity. Dexterity is used for potentially finesse-based weapons on top of ranged attacks, so if you are using a bow or a crossbow or something like that. If that's your game plan, you want a high dexterity, as dexterity will then replace the strength modifier in those instances in terms of your attacks. Dexterity also does a few other things for us though. Mainly it's used in various dexterity checks around things like lockpicking, stealth, the usual stuff. Perhaps more importantly, it also determines two other things. A bonus to our initiative on top of a bonus to our armor class. If you are wearing light or medium armor, you will potentially get a bonus from your dexterity modifier to your base armor class, which will make you harder to hit, which is representative of you dodging the attack. But it also gives us a bonus to our initiative roll, which will help you move earlier in turn-based combat, so very important there as well. Then we have Constitution. Constitution is important for a variety of things, though generally this is reflective of the general health of your character. It affects your hit point maximum, but most of your hit points are going to come from the class you chose, so I wouldn't worry about that specifically, but Constitution is also used for a variety of checks, especially when it comes to spellcasting. It is used for your concentration checks. If you are holding concentration on a spell and take damage, you will perform a Constitution saving throw to hopefully not break your concentration. And we'll cover that a bit more in depth later, but basically, the game checks your Constitution score to see if you can continue to do what you are doing. Then we move on to our mental attributes, starting with intelligence. Intelligence is used for the modifier to a variety of skill checks, so if you are trying to learn something or recall something you know about nature, investigation, just various things like that, intelligence is what you would use. Intelligence is also the spellcasting ability for a wizard, so where appropriate and they need to make a roll for their various spells, such as a spell attack, they would use their intelligence modifier versus strength or dexterity for a martial-based character. Then we have wisdom, which is a reflection of your perceptiveness or your natural intuition, and your ability to actually understand the things that are happening around you. Again, useful for a variety of skills and various saving throws, but it is also the spellcasting ability for clerics, druids, and rangers. And lastly, we have charisma. Pretty straightforward one here, it's just a determination of your personality. That is to say things like confidence, your eloquence, or simply a commanding aura. This is reflective of your ability to lie to people, intimidate them, make some kind of performance, etc., but it is also the spellcasting ability for paladins, sorcerers, bards, and warlocks. All of them use charisma for their spellcasting. Now, an important thing to understand about the ability scores, though, is that your character is not going to be good at everything. Ideally, you really only want to, at most, rely on 2 of these for your particular character and the main things you do. Trying to do everything is a recipe for failure, which is a good time to talk about proficiencies and saving throws. Proficiencies are simply a representation of what your character knows how to do and do well. This is reflected through a proficiency bonus, that is to say, a bonus to a roll that that character gets for anything they are proficient in. This starts as a +2 bonus, and then every 4 levels it increases by 1. So at level 5 it becomes +3, and at level 9 it becomes +4. And with the level cap of 12 in Baldur's Gate 3, that's as high as it's going to get for you. Now, in relation to ability scores, certain classes will be proficient with various saving throws from those ability scores, but only for the saving throw in particular. As when it comes to the related ability checks you might make with those ability scores in relation to skills, that's represented by the skill you are proficient in. And that's because every skill already uses that base ability score as a modifier, so the skills you are proficient in give you a little bit extra on top of that. But saving throw proficiency is specifically for saving throws, which are an attempt to resist something like a spell or an effect that would otherwise harm your character, in an effort to either mitigate it by having the damage potentially or just completely negating it. The number your character has to beat on a given saving throw is usually determined by the effect of the thing that was causing the saving throw to be rolled, so it will vary greatly. But proficiencies also apply to things like your weapons when you're making an attack with one. If you're proficient in the weapon you are using, you can add your proficiency bonus to that. Whereas if you're using a weapon you're not proficient in, you don't get that bonus. Now when it comes to armor, proficiency allows you to use it without taking a penalty as opposed to giving you a bonus. This is especially important for spellcasters because if they are wearing armor they're not proficient in, they cannot cast spells. In addition to just that though, wearing armor you don't have proficiency for will give you disadvantage on any ability check, saving throws, or attack that involve strength or dexterity while you're wearing it. Basically meaning you're not very effective. So this means it's important to use things you are actually proficient in and understand what that means, because otherwise you simply won't get your bonus, or at worst you'll actively take penalties. But now let's move into actual combat. The first things to know about combat actually start right before combat begins, and that is with the turn order. Both 5th edition D&D and the tabletop, as well as Baldur's Gate 3, will be a turn-based system, meaning that the order of those turns has to be determined somehow, and this is what we use initiative for. At the start of combat, everybody rolls initiative. This is a very simple roll. It is a d20 plus your dexterity modifier. The higher you roll, the earlier you get to go. At least generally, as you are required to beat everyone else's score. So from highest to lowest determines the move order, with the highest going first. It is also possible to catch people by surprise, that is to say, you either ambush someone or they ambush you potentially, at which point the person being surprised is subject to a surprise round, which is essentially being robbed of your first turn of combat. You don't get to do anything on your first turn. So if you were to say attack someone from stealth or sneak up on them or ambush them in pretty much any way, this would apply a surprise round, which is definitely a thing in Baldur's Gate 3, so something to keep in mind. Now let's talk about rounds and turns, as it is good to know but not necessarily crucial, as we are playing a video game and not the tabletop. Generally speaking, combat takes place in rounds. Each round is 6 seconds. A round is over when every person has taken their turn. This means that 10 turns would be 1 minute. Though lucky for us, the game pretty much keeps track of everything and how long it should last in turns, and I'm merely mentioning this because if you happen to look something up, many of the rules will talk about actual time increments like minutes, as opposed to converting everything to turns like we see in game. Now let's talk about what we can actually do in combat. Combat is ultimately what I like to refer to as a move and action system, though it is a little more complicated than that. Basically, when it is your character's turn, you will primarily be able to move and take an action. However, this doesn't necessarily need to be consecutive. You can move a little bit, attack, and then take the rest of your movement. The amount of movement available to you is typically 30 feet at a base, and then that can be modified by various things like your race and various effects. You don't have to move or take all of your movement. How much you choose to move is up to you. But then we can take our action. Actions can be a lot of things, but most notably attacking, of course, by far the most common. However, you can also use an action to perform the dash function. Dashing will let you spend your action on doubling your movement. So you won't be able to attack that turn probably, but you can move twice as far. Or you could do something like take the dodge action, which will make you less likely to be hit, though most probably you'll be attacking something most of the time. Before we talk about attacking, though, it's important to understand a few other types of actions. In addition to moving and an action, there are 2 other things you can potentially do, which are bonus actions and reactions. Bonus actions are, of course, very quick actions, and these are usually things like drinking a potion or something. However, many abilities will potentially let you do things as a bonus action, and outside of an instance of a subclass, you'll get 1 bonus action per turn typically, which is also the case for a reaction. However, the caveat to reactions is that typically you don't take a reaction when you are in control of your character, as you are reacting to something another character does. Various abilities can be activated as a reaction, however, you can only do that once until it rolls back around to your turn again, at which point it will reset. So at a maximum, every time it's your character's turn, you will generally be able to move, take your basic full action, a bonus action potentially, and then while you're waiting for your turn again, you might be able to take a reaction. But most of the time, let's be honest, we'll be attacking things. So let's talk a little bit about how that works. In order to attack something, we need to make an attack roll provided we are in range, but assuming you're next to something and able to hit them, you can make an attack. Your percentage chance of success here is determined by a small math equation. Basically, you're going to roll a d20 and then add your ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus where appropriate. You will always roll the d20 and you will use whatever ability modifier is relevant to the type of attack you're making. So if you are using a regular melee weapon, this will typically be strength, but if you're using a finesse weapon or a bow, this would be dexterity instead. We'll talk a little bit about spells later, but it's a similar case there as well. Now, if you are proficient in the weapon you are using, you also get to add the proficiency bonus to that. So d20 plus ability modifier plus proficiency bonus. That's generally what you're going to be adding up to make your attack roll. That total number has to beat the enemy's armor class. Armor class being a representation of course, armor, but also a character's ability to, say, dodge or simply absorb the blow from whatever you are trying to do. For most humanoid enemies, this is a function of actual armor, but for animals, they use something called natural AC. In any event, though, the higher something's AC, the harder they are to hit, which is why it's important to stack bonuses in your favor using weapons that utilize your highest ability score and that you are proficient in, because raising those things is how you are going to be consistently hitting something. Now, again, the game is going to do this for you. Basically, you're just going to click attack, and this is everything that's happening behind the scenes. But understanding this basic function is how to go about raising your chance to hit. But let's assume you rolled well, you are able to clear your enemy's AC, and you have connected. Now, how much damage did you do? This is determined by your damage roll. For martially focused characters, this is a function of the weapon you are using, which will have a damage die associated with it, which Baldur's Gate 3 handily converts into minimum to maximum numbers for us when we hit something, so you don't need to necessarily know the exact dice you're rolling here behind the scenes. However, in addition to the damage dice from the weapon, you also add on your appropriate ability modifier. If you're using a strength-based melee weapon, you would add your strength modifier, and if you're using finesse or ranged weapons, you add your dexterity modifier. However, it is also possible to deal some extra damage by rolling a critical hit. If, when you go to attack an enemy, you roll a natural 20 on that d20 roll, you will critically hit, at which point you get to double up the damage dice that you are rolling to deal extra damage. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, though, if you roll a natural 1 on that d20, this is called a critical miss, and even if that 1 plus all of your other modifiers would clear the enemy's AC, you still do not hit them. This means even in an absolute perfect scenario, there's always at least a 5% chance you will miss. But much in how we can attack enemies, they can also attack us. Let's assume they get a decent roll and manage to hit us, so how does that actually affect our team? Now, at a base level, I think everyone watching this probably understands the concept of hit points, but the amount you have is a function of your class on top of your constitution modifier. Mostly your class, though. If that gets brought to 0, you're in a bad way, but you're not necessarily dead. Rather, at 0, you become unconscious and move to the dying state, at which point our character will start making death saving throws. These are very simple, they are pass or fail. Anything above a 10 on a d20 roll is a pass, anything below that is a fail. Once that character has either passed 3 rolls or failed 3 rolls, they will either completely die and bleed out, or if they pass, they will stabilize. If they roll a 1, that is 2 failures, and if they roll a 20, they immediately regain 1 hit point. However, while that keeps our characters from immediately dying, it's also possible for our team to help them, of course, which we can do with the help action. This will get them back up on their feet and prevent them from dying. It's also possible to just heal them, of course. That said, it's also possible for a character not to go into the dying state if they take big enough damage. In particular, if you take damage equal to your maximum health below 0, you instantly die. So if I was sitting at 1 HP right now, but I had a total of 12 and then I take 13 damage, that character is just dead. That's not necessarily the end. This is a video game, so there will be ways to resurrect your characters, typically through scrolls, so don't worry if someone actually dies, you can still fix that. It won't be the end of the world. Now let's talk damage types and resistances. As you've probably noticed, all of our spells and types of attacks typically deal a specific type of damage. This can be things like slashing, bludgeoning, fire, acid, the usual stuff. That's important to note because enemies will either be unaffected by this, that is to say they take normal damage, or they will be resistant or vulnerable. Resistant means they take half damage to whatever you roll. So if I were to hit something for, say, 30 damage, and they were resistant to it, then it would drop down to 15. Whereas if they are vulnerable to a specific type of damage, it becomes double. This, of course, applies to us as well, so if you have effects that potentially make you resistant to certain things, that can help you out, especially if you are fighting against something dealing that kind of damage. From there, though, I want to talk about advantage and disadvantage. One of the ways in which 5th edition D&D moves away from a very math-heavy system is by simply introducing advantage and disadvantage to various situations. Basically, either through the use of skills or simply a situational advantage, you might have a better chance to hit or a better chance to fail, potentially in the case of disadvantage, and that is reflected through dice rolls. In both cases, we will roll an extra d20. In the case of advantage, we will roll twice and take the higher number, and in the case of disadvantage, we will roll twice and take the lower number. This can apply to basically any role in the game based on the situation. For instance, if you're wearing loud metal armor, you will typically get disadvantage to your stealth checks, making you less likely to succeed. But there's all sorts of ways to gain advantage to pretty much anything, and going out of your way to gain that advantage can be a really good way to make it more likely you actually hit something. So this makes it worthwhile to pay attention to how you are approaching something as opposed to just going in guns blazing, because sometimes it can be worth it to get the high ground to gain that advantage. Because if you were to, say, run up on someone with a bow and arrow directly in their face, you would gain disadvantage if you are within 5 feet of them, because you would be engaged in melee combat at that point. The last thing I want to talk about here before we move on to spellcasting is opportunity attacks. Basically, when you are next to something in combat, you are considered engaged in combat with it. And if you are moving out of their range without taking the disengage action, they will attack you as you go to do so, which is also the case if you run by someone as well, typically. So you have to be a little bit careful about how you are maneuvering around various enemies. Though, because this is a video game, you get a nice little visual display if that's about to happen, so it's pretty easy to avoid. Now let's talk about spellcasting. Spellcasting both works similarly and very different from other types of combat. Now, in order to cast spells at all, we of course have to be playing a class that actually gets the ability to cast spells, which is then represented by spell slots. Depending on the class, you are typically either a full or half caster, which will determine the power level of the spells you are going to get access to, with a half caster only being able to cast up to level 5 spells at a maximum, which will be lower than that thanks to the level cap of Baldur's Gate 3, whereas a full caster would get the entirety of their normal spell progression. Or to put it simply, they get better spells faster. Moreover, each class, typically based on half-caster or full-caster, also gains spell slots as they level up. In order to cast a spell, you have to have the resource to do so, which is known as a spell slot. Spell slots have levels associated with them, which fall right in line with the levels of the spells you are using. In order to cast a spell, you have to have at least one spell slot of the level that spell actually is, at a minimum. However, the exception to this is it is possible to cast lower level spells with higher level spell slots, which will usually grant an increased effect via more damage. So while I cannot cast a level 2 spell with a level 1 spell slot, what I can do is cast a level 1 spell with a level 2 spell slot. It'll just deal more damage. However, this only applies to our particularly powerful spells. In order to keep things like wizards and sorcerers and the like casting spells even when they are out of spell slots, we have cantrips. Cantrips are called level 0 spells. Basically, they are simple things that you can cast every turn as your action. They will increase in damage as you level up to keep them relevant, though usually they won't perform as well as an actual leveled spell. From there, some spellcasters are prepared casters, others are spontaneous. Prepared casters means that you cannot cast every spell you know right out of the gate. You first have to prepare your spells. In Baldur's Gate 3, this means going to a menu and setting them, and you don't have to rest or anything. In the tabletop version, you'd have to rest before you were able to use them for the day, which is part of the preparation process. Other casters are known as spontaneous casters. They typically have fewer spells known total, however, they can cast all of those spells without having to prepare them. So they don't necessarily have to know what they're facing ahead of time, as they can simply cast every spell they have available with their available spell slots. But we're not done yet. Spells, much like pretty much everything else, will either take up an action, a bonus action, a reaction, so spells themselves have so many effects it's hard to go over them in any real capacity in a shorter video. But basically make sure that you understand what the spell does that you're actually trying to cast and what kind of action it is going to take or be triggered by. And that's before we start talking about things like their range and their shape, if you will. Is it a cone, a cylinder, a square, etc.? Because ultimately spells can have a variety of effects that can really change the battlefield, and in many cases, this requires a few modifications to the way we roll attack and damage for them in comparison to martial things. So first and foremost, if you are casting a spell that happens to require concentration, that is to say it has a persisting effect, then your character has to keep concentration on it. This means they cannot cast another spell that would require their concentration, because they're spending all their concentration keeping this spell going. So if you cast another one, it will just cancel the first one. In addition, if you get hit, you will have to pass a Constitution saving throw to keep concentration, and if you fail that saving throw, you lose the spell. Now, when it comes to attacking creatures with spells, sometimes you will have to make an attack roll for the spell. These are generally considered ranged attacks, but that's mostly for things like if you're standing really close to an enemy, then you would have disadvantage. As for the actual attack roll, this is your D20 plus that class's spellcasting ability. So if I'm casting as a sorcerer, I would use charisma. If I was casting as a wizard, I would use intelligence. Plus our proficiency bonus. So rather than dexterity or strength, we use our appropriate casting stat. However, that's only the tip of the iceberg for spells, because many of them affect an area, not an individual target. In those cases, you don't roll attack rolls or anything. It simply affects everything in the area. However, everything in that area will typically receive the chance to roll a save, which can potentially mitigate some of the damage. This is usually dexterity, but it depends on the spell, at which point they will have to clear your spell DC in order to mitigate whatever the effect was. They will have to roll 8 plus your spell casting ability plus your proficiency and then any other modifiers that affect this. So if I had a 16 in intelligence and I was a wizard casting a fireball or something, that 16 intelligence would correlate to a +3 modifier, which means the DC for that would be 8 plus 3 plus whatever my proficiency bonus is. So if it's a fireball, it would be +3, which means the DC for that would be at least 14. So if they rolled their saving throw and it was higher than 14, then they would only take half damage from that. So that's typically how area of effect spells are handled. And just a final note on spellcasting before we move to wrap up. Remember that in order to cast spells with a class, you have to have proficiency with the armor you are wearing, if you are wearing armor. As long as you have that, you'll be able to cast spells in armor. If you don't have that proficiency, you simply won't be able to cast spells. And this is how paladins can cast spells in heavy armor, as a simple example. Now, as we move to wrap this video up, having discussed many of the basics, as you move through combat and you're spending resources like your spell slots or any other class-specific resource, oftentimes those are recharged and restored by resting, either a short or long rest. Various abilities can be restored on a short rest as opposed to a full rest, but a full rest is simply like an 8 hours night of sleep. This will typically restore your health and reset all of your spell slots and everything and get you ready to continue moving through combat with restored resources. However, resting in Baldur's Gate 3 does require a small amount of supplies, so it's not completely free, but more often than not you can rest pretty easy in Baldur's Gate 3, so don't worry too much about spending your class resources on combat. Though don't forget to take advantage of the short rests, as oftentimes that can reset various class features, etc., so you don't need to take a full rest every single time. That though is pretty much going to cover the combat basics for Baldur's Gate 3 alongside a bunch of other stuff. Again, to really drive this home, the game is going to handle most of this for you. It's helpful to know how these things work and how they are added together and everything, because that's going to help you make decisions with your class and build. But in terms of handling all that math and whatnot, the game does all of that for you. It's pretty intuitive, which is honestly the nicest thing BG3 has going for it. So if any of this sounded remotely intimidating, it's really not that bad, especially in the video game format. And because of that, while this can seem intimidating at first, especially if you've never played tabletop games or games like CRPGs in general, once you get a feel for it, it is very easy to get going and get to grips with everything else going on. That said, if you're curious about what individual classes can do for you, I've covered all of them but the monk as well. If you want a good look at what the class fantasy of them on top of their general mechanics is, that could be a great place to go from here to learn more about the game before diving into it, or just making a decision on what you want to play. That said, that's going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.